As more and more athletes come forward as using cannabis for training and recovery, many regular folks who exercise to stay fit are considering adding it to their health plan as well. Exercise and cannabis are not obvious friends, since many people assume that when you use cannabis, you sit on the couch and eat all the snacks. And while that's certainly a possibility, many more people are up and motivated, hiking or working or surfing or reading or writing or even taking care of the kids. The idea of the couch-locked stoner is really more of a stereotype than an actuality. The inspiration for this episode came from the movie American Beauty. In that film, the Kevin Spacey character is going through a midlife crisis, and he turns to cannabis, weightlifting, and fantasy to get him through it. He says that he's working out because he wants to look good naked, and I think many of us identify with that. It got me thinking about the relationship between cannabis and exercise. I wanted to understand if cannabis and exercise were complementary. I wanted to know if cannabis could help all of us look better naked. If you want to learn about cannabis, health, business, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we're giving away pretty cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. There's nothing else you need to do to win except receive the newsletter. So go to shapingfire.com to sign up for the newsletter and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I'm your host, Shango Los. Today, my guest is Greg Gerdeman. Greg Gerdeman is a neurophysiologist with expertise in the endocannabinoid system. He has received research support from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the National Science Foundation, and his articles have appeared in the journals such as Nature Neuroscience, Trends in Neuroscience, and Neuropsychopharmacology. His research while an assistant professor of biology at Eckerd College included the molecular physiology of cannabinoid receptors and their evolution within neural systems. Greg is presently Chief Scientific Officer at Three Boys Farm in Florida. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again, Shango.
Yeah, it's so great to have you back. So let's start off with a quick summary of the endocannabinoid system for folks, because while certainly more people know that they have an endocannabinoid system than used to know, it's still pretty new to a lot of folks. And honestly, since you have got a history of being a professor, you're actually really darn good at teaching it. So let's start there so that we can build on that throughout the show. So will you summarize what the human endocannabinoid system is and how we want to work with it?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the compliment. And more people do know for sure, having talked about this for many years. But the endocannabinoid system is really how the endocannabinoids work. And this was discovered out of a scientific quest to understand how cannabis works in the body. Of course, all of that was mostly biased towards how it's bad and hurt you and is wrong. But even with that bias, we discovered the endocannabinoid system, which is intrinsic to our body as a mechanism for resilience, I believe, and homeostasis. The endocannabinoids as players in our body can be called sort of like the body's own THC or cannabinoids. They are, if you're familiar with molecules at all, they're lipid molecules. They come from the membranes of cells, not just in the brain, but all over the tissues of the body, and act at certain receptors in order to dampen excitation, and they do many different things. But on a basic level, we've got these endocannabinoids called anandamide and 2-AG. They're molecules that act in many ways like THC. They act at receptors that are on cells, and they include CB1 and CB2 cannabinoid receptors. This is sort of the, I guess, traditional, if you will, endocannabinoid system. Those endocannabinoids and the CB1 and CB2 receptors. We now know it's quite a bit more complicated than that, and this is a system that your body uses all the time to regulate metabolism, motivated behavior, the synchrony and rhythms of your brain. In fact, many people will know that when all of this was discovered, it was hugely surprising to brain scientists, people like me who study receptors and how drugs and hormones and neurotransmitters work, because the CB1 cannabinoid receptor, when it was discovered way back in, well, 89 and then more thoroughly in 1990, uh, we discovered that it's the most abundant receptor system in the brain by far. So our brains are really highly evolved to respond to cannabinoid signaling. And of course, evolved with the endocannabinoids in our body, but the cannabinoids of cannabis has been with us a very long time as well.
So if we're looking at the endocannabinoid system as our body's master regulator, constantly trying to bring us back to homeostasis, like you said, or bring us back to balance. If we're running hot in a category, it will help bring it down and bring us back to center. If we're cool in a category, or slow or stagnant in a category, well, it like amps it up. So no matter if you're high or low, it's bringing you back to best case scenario for your body. Well, this makes a lot of sense then, right? That this body master regulator would be impacted and be an active participant every time we exercise, right? Because we've got breathing and blood flow and muscle sets and adrenaline and all these other things that are playing a
Yeah.
role in exercise.
Yep.
They're also playing a role in the endocannabinoid system. So how does cannabis help us work with the endocannabinoid system generally when we exercise? What are we doing when we're interacting with the endocannabinoid system generally when we exercise?
Well, I'm part of what I think is so exciting is how much we have yet to learn, and that now these kinds of questions are something we can ask out in the open and really explore it. And with today's cannabis, that we're able to understand the diversity of it. But from a starting point, what we've come to find out, and work that I did was part of this, but many other groups have shown that when you exercise, your body elevates its endocannabinoid levels. That's one of the kinds of activities that can increase circulating levels in the blood of anandamide, at least as an endocannabinoid. And so there's part of the benefit, the physiological benefit of aerobic exercise, but it's also been seen with resistance training. Anandamide levels go up, and to the effect that there's sort of an analgesic effect, a euphoric effect that may help to motivate behavior in the first place. This is all just something that is intrinsic to how our exercise physiology evolved. And you're right, the physiology of exercise is a really unique case. I mean, skeletal muscle and fat tissues and depth of breathing, and so much goes on during exercise that is special compared to how our bodies normally work. And that's because the human being and our hominid ancestors, we evolved out of a lineage that evolved to be exercisers. And the endocannabinoid system, I believe, was a key part in what made that happen. I'm really on this idea that endocannabinoids actually are part of the evolvability of these sorts of processes.
Let's dig a little deeper in that, because when we were chatting before, as we were setting up this interview today, I thought it was really interesting. You're talking about the evolution of humans as a running animal, right? As a running being, and
Yeah.
how essential and integral the endocannabinoid system is to that kind of long distance running. I mean, one of the reasons humans could get meat is that because over time they would run down these animals that might be faster, but they didn't have the same stamina that we had, right?
Right.
So why don't you riff on that a little bit, because I think you've got some interesting stuff there.
Yeah, there are hunter-gatherer groups in Africa, to this day that hunt with sort of persistence or exhaustion techniques. Well, just like you said, a band of hunters can basically jog an antelope down to exhaustion. And for that kind of behavior to evolve would have been a multi-step process over time. You look back tens of thousands of years to when our hominid ancestors were largely in trees or near them. There was a big shrinking of the forests of East Africa and areas where Homo sapiens evolved, so that you got the development of these big savanna grasslands. And um, whether it's hunting to exhaustion or just foraging from place to place, it was adaptive. So the field of biological anthropology, believes this. These aren't controversial things I'm talking about. It was those ancestors who were better at running were more successful, whether it was hunting or following a vulture to where something had been killed, or just getting to a better place to forage. Um, Endurance running was adaptive, and so traits that favored endurance running were adaptive. And you see in humans skeletal muscular features, like the length of the Achilles tendon and certain ways that the head and the hips sit in their sockets, and the length of the femur, that make running less energetically demanding. Well, what would have motivated that behavior in the first place? Because running intrinsically increases your risk of predators, of injury, and the endocannabinoids fit in nicely as an explanation, in that when you engage in the behavior and you get sort of a runner's joy out of it from increased circulating endocannabinoids, your sense of wellness improves. The taste of the food you found is actually better because of the endocannabinoids. This is all well steeped in research and similar to how cannabis can affect you. It would have promoted behavior, a culture of behavior, and that is a positive feedback loop driving, we believe, the evolution of humans to be, quote unquote, born to run, endurance runners. And the endocannabinoids are really involved. They don't just get activated when you're from exercise, but the way they stimulate uh, appetitive food seeking, they help to desire and promote feeding. And that's something that goes way back to deep evolutionary time. Even very simple organisms like worms and hydra that are pre-jellyfish are have an endocannabinoid system that seems to interact with the control of metabolism and feeding behavior. That's where our endocannabinoid system evolved from. But in vertebrate animals that, of course, include mammals, became humans, at the base of the vertebrate family tree, what we call invertebrate chordates, that's when these CB1 and CB2 cannabinoid receptors seem to have evolved. And only there do you start to see a DNA sequence that's like the CB1 cannabinoid receptor. And lo and behold, in the time span of evolutionary development, vertebrate animals have these systems. What is special about a vertebrate animal? Well, an evolutionary biologist will they have identified what we call vertebrate innovations that appear in our lineage and nowhere else. And they are including a peripheral nervous system, a very incredibly complex and large head and brain, an adaptive immune system that recognizes previous threats and responds and remembers them. Um, these are things that the endocannabinoid system is all about regulating. It is the endocannabinoids, and the CB1, CB2 receptors are master regulators of metabolism, inflammation, the immune response, and regulation of the complex brains and nervous signaling. Then that's not, that's not cannabis culture talk. That's as mainstream as science get, that the endocannabinoid system is the master regulator of physiology. And you don't see that talking in other literature. But I mean, I can go on about this connection,
Well, let me
because
point
there's a
yeah, let me point you in a continued direction, because I like what we're talking,
yeah.
because the basing the endocannabinoid system in this long history of human evolution, I like how it takes it out of drug culture and like stoner culture, and even out of science, right? Because science
Yeah.
is often trying to, like pure medical science is often very on a pedestal, right? But when you get to evolutionary science and anthropology, suddenly things get a lot more visceral, right? And a lot a
Yeah.
lot less cherished. And so going back to what you were saying, I love the beauty of the idea of the endocannabinoid system appears in us as our DNA starts to become more human, and then part of that is that we when we spark the endocannabinoid system, it creates a state in us that we enjoy food, and we're also chasing our food. So not only is the endocannabinoid system modulating our running experience and giving us that runner's joy, but also we're chasing down our food so that we can get more complex fats to build our brain. And oh yeah, once you
Yes.
get there and you capture the animal and you eat it, your endocannabinoid system is already like primed for a fantastic meal.
Yes.
And how that comes together, it's just freaking beautiful, right? It's like
Oh, it's so
it's like
beautiful.
hell
It
yeah,
is beautiful.
nature.
It's beautiful because it teaches us more about who we are. And that's something I like to say a lot, that the science of cannabis has taught us much more about how cannabis works. It's taught us a great deal about the biology of who we are and what it means to be well. But jumping into your scenario, yeah, you run. There's a control of your metabolism and your repetitive drive. But guess what has also been very cleanly and repeatedly shown in various animal research models? The endocannabinoid system helps to stimulate neurogenesis. You're not only collecting fats to feed your brain, you're stimulating mechanisms that promote the growth of the brain, that help to create resilience to the anxieties of life by promoting healthy regeneration of nervous tissue, which we know does happen throughout life. And there's been lots of studies showing that cannabinoids stimulate neurogenesis, including plant cannabinoids, including as a consequence of exercise, and it doesn't happen if you block the CB1 cannabinoid receptor. Even some undercited research that I really like by a group in Germany. A friend of mine, Susanna Wolf, was the first author of one of these papers. They a difficult experiment to do, giving animals an enriched environment over a period of time. You may a lot of listeners may be familiar with sort of this rat park um, literature about how a lot of animals are not housed in a good situation and in research. It's kind of deprived, and when you give animals enriched environments, there are lots of measures of health benefits there. And for example, they're not as likely to be, self-administering cocaine and that kind of thing. But the point here is Susanna's work was that she did a very long controlled experiment that's hard to fund, um, and found that enriched environments stimulated neurogenesis greater rates in brain areas where it occurs, the hippocampus of the mouse brain, and that this was blocked in animals that had CB1 receptors blocked, either with the genetically they didn't have it, or they were blocking it with the chemical antagonist. So back to the running thing, we know that over the history of hominid evolution leading to Homo sapiens ourselves, as greater running mobility occurred in the fossil record and over the course of evolution, as species became more mobile and better runners, their brain size also increased. Their head size, their brain size. And this makes sense from a natural selection perspective in that as an animal is uh, a species is getting better at running, your survival demands are different. You're better at foraging, you're getting more metabolic support, but the complexity of the environment, moving, traveling farther, covering more different terrains at different rates, your need for processing speed is greater to be able to see changing environments, remember your environment, have flexibility to new encounters that you're more likely to have. And so the evolution of humans as were to be runners also included a growth in the brain, and endocannabinoids we know are stimulated by running, and we know that endocannabinoids are linked to neurotrophic factors and things that cause increased neurogenesis. We see it, we know the mechanism. So part of the fun about talking about evolution is it is always going to be speculative, right? Because it's something that's happened in the past. But man, the pieces are really beautiful to make this perspective and support this perspective that the endocannabinoid system helped to support the evolution of who we are as runners and the metabolic activity that we have. Some of the thinking on exercise and metabolism is that, you know, Western society is dealing with such issues related to metabolism, diabetes, obesity, um, sedentary lifestyles. And we evolved not only to be runners, but our metabolism evolved with a running sort of set point. That we're kind of hard uh, plumbed to burn through calories like we're running. And if we don't have exercise in our life, that extra calories that you want to intake, because you're just set to that, it ends up going to inflammation.
Yeah.
And when we run an exercise, that's another thing, oh, by the way, that the endocannabinoids clearly do. They dampen down inflammation. And so, yeah, I love the whole area, and it does support how natural cannabis medicine, as a complement to that physiology is. But it's not just about cannabis, it's about understanding ourselves and how an active mobile lifestyle is healthy. It's how we evolved, and it's um, it's a natural thing to do.
I work with patients a lot around the country, and often I'll get people saying, I want to use cannabis because I have insomnia, right? And we can talk all about using THC short term and CBD to make the sleep cycle better, all that. But I always start with, are you drinking coffee in the morning? Right? Because if you're drinking coffee in the morning, the caffeine half-life means that when you go to sleep, you still have active caffeine in your body, even if you only had one cup. And of course, no one wants to hear that, right? No one wants to no one wants to give up their cup of coffee to get rid of their insomnia. They want to keep their cup of coffee, and then they want to, take some kind of purple flowered cannabis to help, slow them down at night. Similarly,
Exactly.
to use your example, people are often, why do I have endocannabinoid deficiency, or why is it so common? And of course we go through the modern American things, stress, poor sleep, poor nutrition, too many pharmaceuticals, environmental toxins. But really, it's that lack of mobility, right? Like our bodies are designed over, generations and generations to be mobile, to do physical work, to take in calories, to burn them off. And now we're, driving our cars and sitting on the sofa. And I mean, hell,
Yeah.
most of the time I'm working, I'm either like standing up talking to people, or I'm sitting at my computer, or on a plane sitting at a computer,
Yeah.
right? And I'm one of those people. We all need to get more mobile. And I like what you said, how cannabis teaches us more, or reminds us more where we came from, right? Because it's showing that, okay, if modern life is not working for most everybody, what can we learn about how we used to live that can help us be healthier now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, health and fitness is not, all about endocannabinoids, as we can sometimes get into, but endocannabinoids are a master regulator. And I think it's legit to say that, the endocannabinoid system has been under sort of a multi-pronged attack with the modern, that is to say, Western lifestyle, with all the things you're saying, sedentary ism, and not having as many leafy greens that'll support a healthy microbiome, and healthy fatty acid balances that help to generate the endocannabinoids themselves. We know chronic stress wears down the endocannabinoid system. It just makes sense. Endocannabinoids are a buffer against stress, but when you beat up your buffers, you run dry. And that's a metaphor, but promoting a health and well-being from an endocannabinoid perspective, I think, is a exciting direction. That I certainly like looking at it that way.
Right on. So in our second set, we're going to start talking specifically about how cannabis can help us with different types of exercise and athleticism. But before we go to the first commercial break, I want to go, all the way back to where we started this set, because you talked a little bit about how cannabis can help motivate us towards exercise, right? And we've laid out this case that we do need movement, and if we move, our endocannabinoid system will reward us with all of this increased health and thriving nature. But I know I'm not the only one who I'm busy and I travel and I don't find the time for as much exercise as I want to, even though I continually am getting better at it. I'm not there yet, but I liked what you said, though, that there are aspects of using cannabis that can help motivate us towards exercise when that is not the general belief, right? Most people are thinking about lazy, sedentary stoners, and certainly there are other factors that play a role in that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how cannabis can help move us closer to exercise, and so that maybe some of us can get a little more motivated.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's very true. And it's going to, in my view, the way we're talking about it, because of course we can talk more later that there's a lot of talk about, cannabinoids in terms of recovery because of anti-inflammatory values. And having an anti-inflammatory a little on board ahead of time, exercising, a natural one, may be beneficial. But we're talking about motivation, and we're talking about that kind of sort of affect. I think we're probably talking about using it in low doses prior to exercise. And maybe it's because you just learned that it helps you get in a zone, helps you be less attached to other distractions so you can focus on it. I certainly spoke, I remember 20 years ago talking to someone when I was first getting into this research, a scientist I was with at Vanderbilt said, yeah, I used to be with this running club out in Eugene, Oregon, and we would all take edibles like half an hour before we ran. Then we'd all we'd go on this like 12-mile run, and he was like, it's totally helped me get in the zone. And I've heard that many times now. It's been much more popular. There's a lot of ultra athletes talking about that now. But whether it's that or even not just a long distance zone where you need to sort of wear away the hours while you're exercising, there may be just a way to sort of let loose of what's holding you back. And I think about it in terms of weight room training and that kind of exercising where you might be self-conscious about form or what your performance is, how much something's weights are rattling. And I think a judicious use of cannabis can maybe help you get past that your own resistance is holding you back. Like I related when I was talking to you earlier about hand drumming, which is something I love to do and have trained in. And a lot of times what holds you back from making a great rhythm is yourself. It's your inhibition from actually making the impact and with the drum and just feeling it. And I think the same thing is getting in with the training. I mean, it's like if you're training and trying to get over a hurdle, there's a value to being coached through it, and that's because it helps release sort of your descending neural pathways that put a little safety check on your own actions. You get coached through something, you're able to push through a little harder. And I'm not trying to go too far about what I know that endocannabinoids or cannabis does or doesn't do, but I like to think about the idea that having a little bit of cannabis on board can help you to get past your own resistance and sort of negative body type or whatever and just do it. And then maybe with experience, then going to the gym or whatever your training situation is, taking that little bitty, and I do tend to say this would be what we'd call a micro dose, just a small little dose, can even kind of be a conditioned experience. Like, yeah, okay, there's my exercise zone. Let's get this.
Yeah, well said. During the introduction, I talked about that great scene in the movie American Beauty, where the Kevin Spacey character, he's having all sorts of life problems, right? But to kind of reclaim his life, one of the things he decides to do is he gets a weight bench, and he's starting to smoke some weed again, and he's putting on some of the music that energizes him. And I get that, man. I know that if I get too high, then doing resistance training at the gym or something, like being at the gym is too weird and bright, and I just don't want to be there. But if I just have a little hit off my one hitter, right? Or for many people that'd be a vape pen, like nowadays, right? Just that little bit, it kind of loosens up the fact that I generally don't want to be there lifting weights, and suddenly I'm like, all right, I'm here, and I'm in a much better mood than I was a couple minutes ago. Let's get going, and it kind of gets me over that initial hump of, oh my God, I got all these other things I should be doing. But cannabis for a lot of people makes you very emotionally present with where you are. And I find that's really the only way that I can work out, is if I forget the rest of my life that, acts as a distraction, all the stuff I should be doing. And, and most of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is going to be tincture based. But for me specifically with lifting, a little inhaling, followed by some weight training, that really works for me. And I think it does for a lot of people.
Yeah, it works for me. I dig it. And I laugh a little bit about the American Beauty reference, because my buddy Mike, who got me back into training a couple years ago, and I'm in the best shape that I've been since college, and I've been happy about that. And it doesn't always involve a little bit of cannabis, but it usually does. And it's he laughed at me and referred to that exact clip when I came to him a couple years ago, and was just like, I'm not happy with how I look. And he jokes because that character was asked, like, what are you trying to hit? Were you trying to run certain 8 miles or whatever? He's like, I just want to look good naked.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, hey, I want to look good. But public health and epidemiological studies have shown that overall cannabis users tend to have a lower body mass index. It's not that we are fatter and lazier. And actually, so germane to this conversation, Shango, a paper it's not even fully released, but it was announced as a pre-release by a group out of Colorado, and Ken Hutchinson is one of the senior authors, who did a online survey amongst people using cannabis in legal states, had something like 600 respondents, and the questioning was, do you endorse the use of your cannabis around exercise? And a large majority, I believe it was approaching around 80% of cannabis users, associated it with helping them or endorsing it with exercise. More of them were relating it to the recovery phase. But a significant number, I look forward to reading the actual paper, a significant number did discuss it in just the way that you and I are, that it helped to motivate them or support their performance in some way. And I was at a panel on the Emerald Cup in December with some great athletes, and they too were, across the field, a lot of athletes do feel like there's a benefit to, whether it's flow state or something of that, whatever you want to call it. You and I have just been talking about it in terms of, all right, I'm there, I'm ready to go. And I think these are all just fascinating topics, and moreover, they're topics that are all about helping people feel better.
Yeah, damn straight. So after the break, we are going to come back and we're going to talk more about cannabis and the actual physiology of exercise. So stay with us. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is Greg Gerdeman, Chief Scientific Officer at Three Boys Farms. This message is for folks who grow cannabis. I'm talking to home growers, patients, and commercial growers too. I'm probably talking to you. When you plan out your next growing cycle, be sure to check out Humboldt CSI seeds at humboldtcsi.com. Caleb Inspecta and his family have lived in Humboldt County for over 100 years. For the last 40 years, 3 generations of his family have cultivated extraordinary Sensimilla cannabis in Humboldt, Mendocino, and Trinity counties. Because of his lineage and the hard-earned experience that comes from growing up, smoking, and sifting large populations of cannabis plants in Northern California, the seeds you'll cop from CSI will be winning genetics based on longtime heavy hitters and updated and resifted to bring out new and exotic traits and better yields. Go ahead and ask around. Caleb, also known as Inspecta and Pirates of the Emerald Triangle, is a breeder's breeder. He reaches way back and works with significant strains, recreating them in new and interesting ways that you'll love as a toker and a grower, as well as offering you some surprises that will delight serious seed traders and cultivators. Humboldt CSI goes a further step and selfs all these chemovars so you know all the seeds will be female. These are not experimental feminized seeds. Humboldt CSI releases some of the best female seeds available anywhere, and it will show in your garden. Folks grew quite a bit of CSI Humboldt genetics last year here on Vashon Island, and everyone was pleased. The patients had beautiful female plants and didn't have to cull half of their garden as males. The folks growing for the fun of getting high grew colorful flowers with exceptional bag appeal and great highs. And breeders had 7 out of 7 females in a pack, which gave them a lot of phenotypic choices. Take a moment right now and visit HumboldtCSI.com. You'll find an up-to-date menu of both feminized and regular lines, along with photos and descriptions. That's HumboldtCSI.com. Now that the health benefits of terpenes have become well known in the cannabis industry, people everywhere are looking for the purest terpenes without adulterants. The problem with most terpene providers is that they're not sourced naturally and instead are made as a byproduct of refining petroleum, and that's so sketchy. The terpenes sold by True Terpenes are entirely different. They are certified organic, non-GMO, and food grade. That means that they are extracted from real plant sources. There are no solvents of any kind. They are distilled only with steam. That's right, only steam. In fact, terpenes from True Terpenes are so pure that you can eat them. Not only that, but you can stack them with better results too. And what I mean is, other companies' terpenes have got a few percent of impurities, and when you stack those terpenes to make your blend, you're adding a variety of impurities that degrade your final product. True Terpenes also have strain-specific terpenes for a wide range of cannabis strains like Durban Poison, Sunset Sherbet, and Granddaddy Purple. True Terpenes has robust and supportive customer service, so your questions will get answered fast and efficiently. If you shop for terps before, you know how rare that is. So whether you want to cup your hands to smell some beta-caryophyllene to calm down after getting too high, or if you want to dab some pinene so your lungs feel fabulous and your mind feels liberated, True Terpenes will provide you with a truly natural experience. If you are a cannabis product developer, these are the terps you want to add to your oil or edible or capsule or whatever. True Terpenes are simply the best your money can buy. Don't try and make a premium product with substandard terps. Choose True Terpenes for a top shelf experience. Go to shapingfire.com/True Terpenes to find out more, or click on the link in this week's newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shangolos, and our guest this week is Greg Gerdeman, Chief Scientific Officer at Three Boys Farm. So before the break, we were talking a lot about the historical significance of the endocannabinoid system and how we evolved as mobile human beings, and then a little bit about motivation, because as we all know, getting motivated to exercise in the first place is a challenge for a lot of people, including me. So in this set, we're going to talk more about the impact, the interplay between the human endocannabinoid system, cannabis, and exercise, and how they're working together to, build a better human. So Greg, why don't we start there? Specifically, how does supplementing our body with cannabis help us strengthen and build muscle?
Well, that's tough. I mean, I'm a scientist, so I'm always going to back up and say, well, we're not totally sure about that. But there's the cannabinoid system working with cannabis in that it can help support better, metabolism and storage of fats may help. And here's another piece that's pretty mysterious, is that we now know that there are cannabinoid receptors actually on mitochondria that are the AP generating powerhouses of the cell, right? Wow. That's really weird that there's a neurotransmitter receptor that's on the surface of neurons and all over the body, and it's also found on mitochondria. That's part of what makes this receptor system so different, and it's literally a mechanism. The endocannabinoid system is not just a system like, here's a group of cannabinoid producing cells and they project everywhere. That's like the case, we were talking about dopamine I can point to every dopamine cell in the brain, and they project everywhere, but there's the dopamine system right there. The endocannabinoid system is more like an endocannabinoid mechanism that is a fundamental cellular mechanism. It's all over the body. So in when it comes to exercise and you're talking about building muscle, I mean, there's certain aspects that, well, endocannabinoids may be involved in sort of the healing of, micro tears and that kind of thing that is involved in building muscle mass. But here's something I want to go into that you haven't heard from me yet. It's a recent study came out that I'm really excited about, that looks at how endocannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors work at the neuromuscular junction. So the neuromuscular junction is where, when you're doing any voluntary movement, moving a hand, finger, or foot, there are neurons that are coming, called motor neurons, from your spinal cord. Really, it comes from your motor cortex down to your spinal cord, and then your spinal cord sends motor neurons to your muscle. And the release of neurotransmitter called acetylcholine at that neuromuscular junction is what causes your muscles to contract and move. So that's the neuromuscular junction. And whereas we know that cannabinoid receptors and endocannabinoids act at connections between cells in the brain, synapses, like practically every synapse in the entire human brain is impacted in some way by endocannabinoids, if not using it on the regular. Studies of the neuromuscular junction have been less obvious, but a study just came out recently. It was in the journal Scientific Reports, just in the last couple months, showing that endocannabinoids are released by contracting active muscles and travel backwards and hit the neuromuscular junction in this similar way that it does in the brain that I helped to describe, like 2001. But in the brain, there's a key difference here. In the brain, endocannabinoids traveling backwards dampen the release of neurotransmitters and kind of slow things down. At the neuromuscular junction, where physical activity is stimulated, the endocannabinoids actually increase the level of neurotransmission. This was a study done in mice, but there were some really key findings. First of all, they showed a synthetic CB1 agonist did this as well. I wish they had used THC, but such as big animal research, they didn't. But nonetheless, they mimicked it with a cannabinoid agonist activator, and it increased at this is very heady research. I mean, they're like counting vesicles of neurotransmitter released, basically.
Wow.
They show that at that level, it's increased. It's kind of the inverse of what happens in the brain. But why would this be adaptive? I mean, maybe this is part of the ability of exercising muscle tissue to overcome fatigue. You just start increasing the release of how effective the motor neuron is driving the muscle. I mean, the cellular physiology of fatigue and why it happens is not so obvious. And maybe this is a breakthrough understanding in that regard. But secondly, they looked at a mouse model of a disease called myasthenia gravis. Are you familiar with this at all?
No, I'm not.
Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disorder, and it manifests with muscle weakness and clumsiness related to that. That's a short version. You get muscle weakness because, again, it's autoimmune, where the body is developing antibodies to the receptors for acetylcholine that respond to the neuromuscular junction. Okay, so you develop antibodies, they attack your own receptors at your neuromuscular junction, so the efficacy, the tightness of connection between your spinal cord telling your muscles to move is degraded by your own immune system. It's one of these insidious ways that autoimmunity fucks us up in people that have myasthenia gravis. Well, it is something that is very easily modeled in a mouse. You can make a mouse basically allergic to their own acetylcholine receptors. It acts just like myasthenia gravis. They get muscle weakness and progressive, failures because of that. And they showed that giving the mouse a cannabinoid helps to prevent and treat myasthenia gravis. I mean, clinically, if you have this, what you will be prescribed is a medicine that helps to enhance the release of acetylcholine or block its breakdown. This new discovery is that cannabinoids acting at CB1 receptors enhances the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction. Right there, here's another of the limitless examples about cannabis. I cannot stand up in front of a group of doctors and talk about clinical data and say that there's any proof whatsoever that the use of cannabis, be it a tincture, a pill, a joint, I cannot say that the use of cannabis can be a treatment for myasthenia gravis. I have literally zero clinical evidence for that. But the biological underpinning has now been elegantly described that it may be the case. And I'm hoping that in this era of new upstart cannabis companies that I am involved in, these kinds of things can be dovetailed into studies. If not really expensive clinical trials, patient outcomes. Let's recruit people who are using it for myasthenia gravis and find out, does it work? That's observational study. It's not as strong as the controlled clinical trial, but they all start to justify one another.
Yeah, and if we move in that direction, it'll be easier for us to fund those increased in size
Yes.
studies. And this is interesting
Yes.
too, because while I don't have a lot of experience with that particular autoimmune disease, I work with a lot of other folks with autoimmune disease, most commonly usually lupus, and how these manifest for different patients kind of is different from patient to patient, but decreased mobility is incredibly common, right? And so
Yeah.
and we find that high doses of whole plant cannabinoids really work to help. I've heard patients call it loosen the joints, right? To make them feel less like they're rusting, like the Tin Man in Wizard of Oz, right? They feel like they're loosening. And while I've never heard this explanation that you just gave, it certainly seems to be more evidence in that general direction that adding cannabinoid supplementation to our body from this plant acts like an oil can on everything that's trying to stop our mobility.
It sure seems to act in a lot of places like that. Yes, there's a redundancy of function that helps to support these different directions that would enhance mobility. And this piece I'm talking about of could cannabinoids help to increase the function of your neuromuscular junction on this subtle way, but a way that could underlie when people are talking about getting into a flow state. Maybe that's part of it. Your neuromuscular connection is just getting set up and more, high fidelity, and you feel it. And you've got the sense of wellness that comes from the way the endocannabinoids are acting in the limbic system of your brain. And you've got the sense of enhanced bronchodilation that's happening from endocannabinoids working on your upper airways. And it all fits together in some pretty fascinating ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does. And as a matter of fact, I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, my God, this is like a big commercial for yoga, like low impact muscle movement of that kind, creating, an increase of endocannabinoids. Let's circle this all the way back around to the strengthening and building muscle before we move on to different types of athleticism. So, I don't know a lot about sports physiology, but my general understanding is that how we're building muscle is that we rip the muscle, and then as our body goes to repair that, it repairs it, bigger, if you will. And so you're building muscle mass, and then so you rip it today, you heal tomorrow, you rip it today. So that's clearly something that is going to be partially regulated by the endocannabinoid system. How will, having the cannabis to help us be present in the moment is good, and to focus so that we can lift more weight and have better form, that's all good. Mm-hmm. But at the muscular level, how will this support our building and strengthening of muscles?
Well, I don't know that it will. I mean, honestly, and that ripping and tearing is an intrinsic part of that does include inflammation. And I have talked to a sports physician who has expressed to me that he thinks the anti-inflammatory actions of the cannabinoids actually would be working against bulking up and really, if you're weightlifting to build mass, that that may be contrary.
Hmm.
I I don't know. I've I've got a little observation into my own little circles and use of cannabis related to strength training, and I don't, you know, I shouldn't even say. I don't know that it does anything, but at a molecular level, we don't really know. Um, and me talking about what happens at that neuromuscular synapse is not really addressing how the tissue is remodeling during the recovery that can help build mass. Maybe there would be an interference. I don't know how important inflammation is to the actual mass building that goes on. Um,
And we're
but
really
it's
talking
it's an
about
interesting
ratios too,
question.
right? Because if we need some inflammation in the area, maybe we don't need as much as we have. Because a lot of people
Yeah,
love cannabis for recovery, right? And so maybe
right,
like
right.
okay, we rip up the muscles, and which causes its repair and inflammation. But maybe if the cannabis is decreasing inflammation X variable amount, maybe that's where we're getting some of our ease of recovery from these sports.
Yes, I think so. But again, cannabis isn't just the endocannabinoid system isn't just a master regulator of inflammation. It's so much broader than that. And in many vascular beds, endocannabinoids act as vasodilators. Now, that's may not happen all the time, but it, vasodilation is something that is taken. I mean, supplements that is, that are, for example, nitric oxide donors, are taken by weightlifters to improve the amount of weight you can go, the circulation of of oxygenated blood to the tissues is enhanced. Maybe cannabis does that at a level that is not exaggerated, but supportive of sustained muscle function during training. And I mentioned cannabinoid receptors on mitochondria. I mean, the other kind of supplement that is really used to boost both performance and recovery or supplements like creatine, phosphates, and things that will support the regeneration of ATP. If, and this is certainly conjecture on my part, but if the cannabinoid receptors on mitochondria are involved with making mitochondria more efficient, maybe that has something to do with replenishing ATP. That's a very testable question that I don't think anybody has gotten to.
Yeah, well, I certainly haven't seen anything on it, and that actually leads us right next to our next category of sports, which is endurance, right? So if we've got receptors on the mitochondria, we know that the efficiency of the creation and burning of that energy is going to be some way related to the endocannabinoid system.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I guess I
Yeah.
could be wrong.
Sorry, I didn't take that as a baton. I wasn't sure exactly
Yeah, yeah,
what,
yeah. So,
but
so, so let's talk about running and swimming, right? I mean, we clearly talked a lot about running at the top of the show, but these, by our using cannabis, how do you see that for runners and swimmers to add to their overall training regimen?
well, I mean, I just think if it improves their experience and their adherence to the discipline of their sport, then it's going to have the benefits of sticking with it, and um, it could be of great help. Some of this could be this aspect of getting in the zone or combating fatigue um, that cannabis can be involved with, and like I'm saying, there's lots of cellular molecular basis for that. The metabolic benefits that may happen with using a way of using cannabis in your life around training may help to support the kind of changes that again help to shift you to a different set point. And my training partner and I, we've talked about exercise as a vision of homeostasis. I mean, you push yourself out of your zone, and part of the recurrence of training to get your time better, to get your endurance better, is you're kind of forcing a homeostasis to a different set point. I mean, my buddy used to talk about me hitting the red zone because I'm telling you, when I first started training in the gym 2 years ago, again, it's the first time in a long time, I would work out with my buddy Mike for like 20 minutes and I would be like, I would be redlining.
Yeah.
I felt terrible. And the act of continuing to train is really pushing your body into that zone, which I do very much believe we evolved to get into. But, 20 years out of shape is 20 years out of shape. And you have to sort of re-engage yourself to be adaptive in that set point. And there may be some consequence where you don't feel so good when you go weeks without training. But that's another that's another story.
Let me ask this question in a different way too, because I was setting you up because I thought you were going to tell me that there are ways that cannabis can help the performance of swimming and running, the actual physicality of doing it, and you went to mindset, which makes me think that maybe my whole direction I was coming, because I thought cannabis is considered a endurance sport enhancing drug, right? And so it is banned in many sports areas. But this actually creates this idea in me that maybe it's banned not necessarily because it will make you a better swimmer, do the physical act of swimming, but maybe the reason why it's sports enhancing is just because it keeps your head in the game so much more, and your ability to ignore distractions, from the competitor in the next lane over.
Yeah,
Maybe that's it. And I was
I do
actually,
think
I was
so.
go, yeah, huh, that's interesting.
I do think so. And I know like the NCAA right now, it views CBD as a banned substance, of course, because it's uh,
Schedule one, yeah.
unrightly in Schedule One. But even thinking cogently about it, I've talked to a physician with the NCAA who's saying, well, it's an anti-inflammatory and that's performance enhancing because inflammation. That's a wild story because were we going to stop letting people take ibuprofen beforehand? Um, but yeah, I mean that anti-controlling inflammation that may occur during the course of a distance um, sport certainly could help to promote sticking with the behavior. But I think the mental focus, the letting go of grasping, there's a whole other dialogue out there about cannabis and meditation, and I think there's a intersect there in that both are have a relationship to letting go of your grasping, of your discursive mind. And that helps with getting into a meditative place, and it helps with possibly, like you said, not thinking about the competitor, not thinking about what you look like, or even being able to forget the fact that your ankle isn't feeling very well. I mean, not like I'm trying to tell people to push through pain that's there. And that takes me to another little piece that, when we're talking about why cannabis could be performance promoting, whether it should be used in sports. I know we're not primarily talking about things like head injury, but I was speaking at a conference on traumatic brain injury uh, a couple months ago, and I spoke to a fellow who's a doctor. He's a sports physician at a NCAA school, works with football players, and he was talking about the use of cannabis in sports. And I won't go down this whole wormhole, but my feeling is that whether or not cannabis or CBD even on the sideline of games would be preventing people from serious brain injury, and I think it could. I think it's more a question of our athletes, especially in contact sports, our athletes should have a absolute right to be medicating with this medicine because we should be concerned not with just getting them back on the field, but with their longevity as human beings. And I think CBD and full spectrum cannabis products should be allowed and supported by professional athletics because it helps to promote the longevity and health and well-being of the athletes. And the question of whether they can get back on the field real quickly, and earn their paycheck is not the one that the medical profession should be focused on as much.
Yeah, that's a big cultural shift to shift our view of sports players from entertainers to humans, and have
Yeah,
some kind of interest in their longevity.
right.
Yeah, totally, and like being aware of them as a human instead of
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, hang out with a group of 55-year-old NFL players. They're nearly near the end of their natural life if they were like on the offensive line.
Mhm.
Those guys don't have a long life expectancy. And a lot of times, even with a lot of wealth, it's not very happy. And I don't want to roll this up into a whole different conversation, but that is something I feel powerfully about.
Right on, fair enough. So let's talk about the last of the three categories. We talked about strengthening and building muscles, endurance sports like swimming and running. For myself, I play racquetball, and I absolutely know that I play differently with a little bit of THC in my body. You know, if I smoked it, it may actually decrease my breath a little bit because I happen to have asthma. But I swear I've got like a sixth sense of where the ball is gonna go. I see the physics better. I attempt and succeed more aggressive shots. And so like what's your take on that? Is it just am I getting more creative? Am I just more less averse to risk? Like what about these dexterity and mobility based sports where you have to visualize where a sport action is going to take place and then you have to go
Right.
and do it?
It's the fun part about all of this is that because the endocannabinoids and the receptors that cannabis works on are so everywhere in the brain, then you can just think about the neuroscience of performance and think, well, cannabis could totally influence that. All the ways you're talking about, whether it influences you with greater risk taking or sort of sensory motor visual performance. That said, I certainly do have a way to consider this in that um, the the neural circuits in our brain and spinal cord that are involved with executing motor behavior are where some of the greatest expressions of cannabinoid receptors are. And we know that the learning and unlearning of behavioral habits are involve endocannabinoid signaling. And for example, I look at the cerebellum. The cerebellum is part of the brain that sits in the back. Actually, the name means little brain. It is anybody who studied brain function knows that the cerebellum is involved with coordination and timing. And in clinical symptoms of ataxia, various forms of ataxia, discoordinated um, symptoms are related to cerebellar damage. The cerebellum, what it does on a neural circuit level, simplified, is it's constantly processing where your body is in space, like what's actually happening with your body, using input from what we call proprioceptors. If you close your eyes and raise your hand, you can feel very much where your body is because the proprioceptive input is telling your brain, and it's going through the cerebellum to do so. The cerebellum's not only constantly measuring what your body's actually doing, but it is comparing it with what you intend to do and what you expect to happen. And all of these things, like the angle of the racket ball, the angle of the ball coming back off the wall, how you integrate that with the velocity with which you saw it hitting the wall, you know how hard your opponent hit it. You heard the sound of it. You saw you've got where it hit. You got a memory of how your opponent throws a wicked spin on it. All of those kinds of things build a projection in your mind of where that ball is going to go. And to get there, you have to coordinate what your body's actually doing with what you're expecting and what's going on in real time. And again, the neuroscience of this is of course, it's fascinating and it's very mainstream to think that our heads and our brains evolved to make these kinds of computations. And the endocannabinoids are really involved with that. In the cerebellar cortex, where a lot of this circuitry is involved, every single synapse is regulated by endocannabinoids. So in that route, it's not surprising, and much of the research has looked at, hey, how does weed impair you? It's not surprising that high doses of THC will gum up your coordination. There's absolutely a way to overdo it and take so much that is going to impact your game negatively. But if a judicious, more micro sort of dosing of cannabis helps you get in your game and feel that, there's all kinds of biological rationale for why that would be the case. And there are forms of very laboratory controlled cerebellar learning in animals that are dependent on cannabinoid receptors to happen. It doesn't happen as well when you don't have the CB1 receptor. And, that's part of I guess to step back from that a little bit, to segue into what would be like a broader sort of gestalt of this conversation, other conversations. I speculate a lot about how cannabis could enhance performance because I think the underlying neurobiology and physiology is there. But also because there aren't very many people in the world who worked with these genetic knockouts earlier than I did. I'm talking about mice that don't have CB1 cannabinoid receptors. I've been studying that sort of genetic study system. I mean, I'm not in the lab 24/7 now, but then it's not about my experience. The point is the data show us over and over again, lots of different labs, that mammals that don't have CB1 cannabinoid receptors live lives that are shorter, more inflammation prone, more seizure prone, more metabolically messed up. And again, they're prone to early death. So all of these kinds of things. And they run less. We know this too. CB1 knockout mice are less prone to running on an exercise wheel. So it's part of how our brains evolved for endocannabinoids to be master tuners of the rhythms of our brain. Endocannabinoids help to tune them. And when and where and how the compounds in cannabis might improve that in a beneficial way, that has to shake out empirically, and if you're an N of 1 and using cannabis a little bit helps you improve your game, I think that is every bit as believable and justifiable, explainable as it is to say that Louis Armstrong was better playing trumpet when he was a little bit high.
For sure.
It's these kinds of things, and not to speak for a past revered musician who we know used cannabis, but I've been around a lot of musicians in my life who, again, you can overdo it, but that it also can play a role in your motor performance, your dexterity. And we don't have any clinical data to say you're going to be a better guitar player or racquetball player by microdosing cannabis first, but this science does help us understand better who we are. And one thing I've learned from healers of all stripes, whether they are accepted by the medical establishment or not, is that the story we tell ourselves matters. Our perspectives on healing matters. Our perspective on optimum performance matters. There are systems of our body that help to promote that we can access, the endocannabinoid system being a master player among them. And there's a plant that helps us interact with that endocannabinoid system, and there's a reason why it has been revered across human culture since before human language.
Beautiful. That's a great wrap up. So let's pause there and go to our last commercial break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about a whole bunch of variables to this. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is Greg Gerdeman, Chief Scientific Officer at Three Boys Farm. As a listener of Shaping Fire, you already understand the importance of living soil when growing cannabis. When you have active microbe communities in your substrate, you go way beyond simply fertilizing with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Having active microorganisms in your substrate supports vigorous plant growth throughout the plant's root zone, making for higher yields and thriving flowers. Mammoth P is the first organically derived microbial inoculant that focuses on your plant's nutrient cycling processes to release soil phosphorus and other micronutrients from their bound forms, making them more available to the plant. Increased levels of phosphorus will also keep internodes shorter and focus your plant's energy on bud production. Not only that, but the microbes act as a defense shield for the plant's rhizosphere by outcompeting potentially harmful pathogenic microbes. Pretty cool, right? Mammoth P not only unlocks the nutrients in your soil, but it also helps protect your plant from disease. Mammoth P's beneficial bacteria act like microbioreactors, continually producing enzymes that release nutrients. Mammoth P was developed at a U.S. university and has been extensively tested by Colorado growers and independent laboratories. Mammoth P is proven to increase growth and enhance blooming. One of the great things about supplementing with microorganisms is that they won't compete with whatever fertilizer program you're already running. Simply dose on top of your fertilizer schedule for increased benefits. To learn more and to find out where you can buy Mammoth P near you, check out their website at www.mammothmicrobes.com. Partner with microorganisms to create beautiful, thriving cannabis. Mammoth P. Did you know that Shaping Fire has a fabulous YouTube channel with content not found on the podcast? When I attend conventions or speak or moderate panels, I always record them and bring the content home for you to watch. The Shango Los YouTube channel has world-class speakers, including Kevin Jodrey of Wonderland Nursery talking about breeding cannabis for the best terpene profile, Nicholas Mahmood on regenerative and polyculture cannabis growing, Dr. Sunil Agrawal on the history of cannabis medicine around the world, Ben Cassidy of True Terpenes on using terpenes for health in your everyday life, Reggie Gaudino of Steep Hill on the cannabis genome, and Jeff Lowenfels on the soil food web. There are several presentations from Dr. Ethan Russo on terpenes and the endocannabinoid system, and even my own presentation on how to approach finding your dream job in cannabis and why we choose cannabis business even though the risks are so high. As of today, there are over 100 videos that you can check out for absolutely free. Go to youtube.com/Shango Los or click on the link in this week's newsletter. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is Greg Gerdeman, Chief Scientific Officer at Three Boys Farm. So, Greg, let's take a step back from the specifics of sports physiology, and let's talk about cardiovascular health, because even people who are not actively working out or playing a particular sport, they want to have, they want to be heart healthy, if you will, right? And and it's weird, I've been a toker, pretty much my whole life. I've also been a fan of the Beastie Boys pretty much my entire life. And they've got this one song called Heart Attack Man. And they're talking about this guy and he does a lot of stuff that I don't do, right? Like he's into, he's drinking a lot and he's going to, fast food. But the part that I always remember is they talk about him getting high and then playing basketball and they're waiting for him to drop dead on the court, right? And so somewhere, that got put in my brain that whenever I'm working out and and more endurance stuff and my heart starts pounding and I'm high, I always just kind of in the back of my mind think I'm just going to drop over dead. And I don't have any evidence for it. And I've been to my doctor and she's all like, no, you're not at risk. You're fine. And she won't approve a stress test for me so I can make sure. But she's like, there's no reason for you to be concerned about this. And I'm all like, but the Beastie Boys. And that doesn't really get me anywhere. So let's talk about cardiovascular health, because that's one of the worst things in the United States. How can our use of cannabis help us to have healthy hearts that won't crap out on us?
Well, I mean, if it helps to, in the ways we've been talking about, to promote exercise, there's a indirect thing.
Yeah.
But I certainly don't want to come across like cannabis being a magic pill towards better heart health. There's good measures, I think, public health outcomes from, survey basis that cannabis users are in general tend towards better health, but there are concerns around cardiovascular issues. I mean, it could be that cannabis. This is a weird thing. I stutter because this is a place where the human observation in what I've talked about, like with better body mass index, for example, doesn't exactly line up with some of the concerns that have been raised in animal research, that there's greater fat deposition, for example. That part of what the CB1 cannabinoid receptor does is not only promote feeding behavior, but it helps promote the storage of fats. And if the storage of fats helps to create metabolic or cardiovascular risk, well, then maybe that would be some indication against high THC for chronic use. But we don't really know. There hasn't been, in my view, big red flags about cardiac risk or long-term cardiac improvement. I'd like to see more stuff about breaking down cannabis users in controlled studies and looking at real cardiovascular performance profiles, whether it's heart rate variability or ejection fraction and under stress, that kind of thing. Um, I do know that, again, it is animal research, but a study that was published very prominently a few years ago out of Germany showed that in mice, which do get atherosclerosis, and that's, like the hardening of the arteries, that is a sort of the primary risk factor and predictor of larger cardiovascular disease. Um, in mice, especially fed a Western diet, atherosclerosis actually absolutely happens. And in mice that were fed daily really low doses of THC, the severity of atherosclerosis and plaque formation related to it um, was significantly reduced. I mean, this was like published in Nature, a top scientific journal in the world, and it was very low dose. It was something like 0.01 milligrams per kilogram, which is very low for an animal study. And it showed reduced atherosclerosis. Does that mean like a low dose sort of wellness level regular cannabis consumption could help limit uh, atherosclerosis, which is leads to coronary vascular disease, number one killer? It might. It might, whether you smoke it or ingest it in some other way. And I should speak, if we're talking about cardiovascular health, about the worry for adverse outcomes, in that smoking cannabis, taking THC, does lead to a increased heart rate. Clinically, we'll call it tachycardia. There's a transient tachycardia, increased heart rate that happens, and it's part of what supports panic attacks when people have taken more than they were expecting or knew how to expect. When that edible starts kicking in the second hour and you took way too much and your heart starts racing, that can create a negative spiral. Again, it is transient, and even within sort of low dose sessions, you adjust to that. But people who have emergent cardiovascular disease, or maybe at a high risk of stroke, for example, because they know they've got the potential for clots if they're taking medicines for that, then they should be cautious around going too high with THC, because there are people who can suffer a stroke or a cardiac incident simply from having an increased rate, and in that as a side effect, it's something for people to recognize. People, even when we first published our exercise study showing that the runner's joy is related to endocannabinoid signaling, maybe it was you. I had certainly talked to people who asked me, like, all right, so somebody you wanting to get back to exercise can be happy about it. And like, yeah, but if you're someone who's recovering from a heart attack and you are not used to jogging, you don't want to just boost that with a hit off a joint and then go run without taking some consideration. Even that said, I mean, there's not strong clinical data that people are at increased risks of heart attacks, but there have been some studies to suggest that there have been some clinical findings of patients with stroke, with a heart attack, who had been smoking beforehand, and that cause and effect in those incidences may be related.
So, it's always been my understanding or belief, I guess, because I don't have a lot of evidence for this, is that the reason why the heart rate increases with smoking THC, or I guess if you're taking enough edible, but the point is that it drops my blood pressure, which causes the heart have to pump faster to make up for the dropping of the blood pressure. And so is that scientifically accurate, or is that just a myth that I grabbed onto?
No, that makes sense in that because it vasodilates, it can drop your blood pressure, and that can create exactly that. With lower blood returning to the heart, it will compensate by increasing the rate. But it also works in the autonomic control of the heartbeat itself, and can create a transient increase in heart rate, even if you're sitting down, which shouldn't really be accompanied with too much problems from blood pressure.
Right on. Some people do take, THC-based tinctures to lower their blood pressure. Do you think that to get that lowering of the blood pressure, it necessitates also having the increase of heart rate? I kind of, I was under the general idea that the pounding of the heart rate is more related to particular terpene profiles and the excitement of the adrenals. But then also I know about this other decreasing of the blood pressure aspect of it as well. So I'm not really sure how that dynamic works.
Yeah, well, I think if somebody said they were sure about it, they'd be pulling your leg. This is
No,
complex,
that's
and
fair
there's a
enough.
lot
Yeah.
that hasn't been studied. I mean, you're bringing in the adrenals and the release of epinephrine from there. That could be part of it. Um, but no, I don't think anybody really knows. And I too, there hasn't been a real well-controlled study that I know of just looking at changes in resting blood pressure in people who might be, you know, sort of baseline hypertensive. But I have, again, with just these clinical anecdotal findings of people who have found success. I've talked to many people over the years who are like, I started using cannabis for XYZ, and my physician came back to me and said, your blood pressure is great. What are you doing? Keep it up. And is that clinical evidence? Well, not at the standard that we tend to operate when we're talking about medicines and improving medicines, but it's a clinical outcome that I've heard discussed, in a repeated way. And I'd love to know if cannabis use can increase and lower the blood pressure of someone who's running high. I'd sure love to help find out who benefits in that way
Mhm.
and when, and if there are variations in terpene constituents that play a role in that. That's perfectly conceivable. But even, there you get into that whole new angle of terpenes, and um, all of their mechanisms of function are far from clear in the most part.
That's judiciously said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. I mean, these things are effective at exquisitely low concentrations a lot of times, and people say things like, "Oh, myrcene helps THC cross the blood-brain barrier," but this is speculation. There's not good data to show those things.
So far today, we've talked about using cannabis in a lot of different ways to help your human body in a bunch of different ways. Similarly, cannabis can be ingested by different methods, right? There's combustion smoking or a vape pen or my favorite tincture. What are your thoughts on the best mode to ingest cannabinoids based on the different goals we've been talking about today?
Yeah. I mean, the bottom line is always going to be that it depends on the person and how things respond and work well for them. But if you are, if you're wanting a rapid mode of action, that maybe it's certainly if you're talking about breakthrough symptom control, we're talking about medicine, but today we're trying to talk about performance. And again, back to our earlier talk, if you want to sort of find a place that you become familiar with, that's a good zone for your fitness. Then a fast onset like a vape, or vaping oil, vaping flower, taking a hit, that may be what is most effective for you. And if you're not scared of cannabis, it may be the kind of thing to suggest first because you can get a better sense of, yeah, this is how quickly this works. But tinctures and sublingual application can certainly come on pretty fast too. And I'm a big fan, like you said, of tinctures and sublingual oils. I mean, in both for even. I mean, I'm a growing fan of the decarboxylated. I mean, the raw acids.
Yeah,
I think they're highly underestimated, and that people could be popping those in tinctures to great health benefit. Um, Whether it would improve performance, not sure, but it is a quick mode of action. And then when you've got, again, thinking back about performance and mobility, back to my story of a buddy who long ago told me that, they would eat edibles and go on a run. Uh, People who have the kind of um, sport that involves endurance, uh, some sort of edible product might be what they find works to help prolong their zone, their, you know, flow state if they get there. And maybe through the mechanism I mentioned earlier, maybe there's a way to help prevent muscle fatigue or promote muscle function. So, it does come down to what people empirically find works for them, and at this point anyway. And I'd love to see a day where we've got some stronger repeatability, and then I can give more recommendations to the naive user. But right now, I would be cautious about it.
Right on. We talk a lot about individualized medicine on this show, and I would say that this feels a lot like the same way. It's like, okay, for me, I may like to use a 1-to-1 THC and CBD tincture for overall endocannabinoid health and after workout healing from running into the wall of the racquetball court and all. But when I'm going to go lift and I really want to be in the moment, well, then I'm going to, take a small hit off my one hitter, of a little bubble hash or
Yeah,
something.
yeah,
And, and I guess that really is it. I guess the point here is to encourage folks to not assume that all of these solutions are going to be inhaled based, and make sure that you consider the range of modalities that we've got now, which is the most anybody's ever had in human history.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so don't feel like it has to be smoking. Just like when you explain to patients that they don't have to smoke, only kind of
Right.
blows their mind a little bit for the first time.
Right. I mean, we haven't even talked about topicals in this performance piece because I do tend to think more in terms of very local inflammation, but um, there are all kinds of different modes. I mean, when we're talking about sublingual oils, I mean, some dissolvable strip might be very effective as well. But, you know, it's, I'm not going to go out proselytizing to people about that bringing cannabis into their life is going to make everything or make it all better. But a lot of people are using and enjoy and feel like cannabis increases their quality of life. And if you want to bring that into supporting a physical fitness routine, yeah, do that because it might help. And it's so safe to experiment with. Don't think that you're just limited to taking a hit off a joint before you do it, but try a tincture 15 minutes before you start working out and see. You may don't gauge whether it's working by whether you feel high. Gauge whether it's working with whether you worked out well. You feel good about it.
Yeah,
And it doesn't
absolutely.
take anything away from us to put value on the medicine. By saying, "Oh, the medicine helped me," it doesn't take anything. You helped yourself by using a plant product that works with how you evolved. Again, the story that we tell each other ourselves matters.
Yeah, there's a video that I recently put on the Shaping Fire YouTube channel. I'm running a series there right now. The second Shaping Fire sessions I did was with Ethan Russo. The first one was with
Yes.
Kevin Jodrey, and Ethan is very adamant that there is a great deal of cannabis efficacy below the intoxication mark. And so many people think that you need to get high to get the benefits, but
Yeah.
anti-inflammatory is a great example. Serious anti-inflammatory patients will take 2.5 milligrams every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day and be at work, and they've got active cannabinoids, including THC, in their bloodstream all day long, and yet they don't
Yep.
feel anything.
Yeah, absolutely. It's right on. And I've learned a lot from Ethan in that regard, and I parrot him quite a lot here in Florida, where we've got, medical cannabis landscape. And let me tell you, it's hard to go to a dispensary as they exist in Florida and find those low dose. I mean, to be able to take something really easy at a 2.5 milligram level repeatedly, the companies that play in Florida are more interested in higher dose products. And I'm not dismissing high dose and that that's valuable medicine
It's
for the
got its
kinds of
place too. Exactly.
diseases that yeah, but no, exactly. You don't have to titrate to feeling high, but to improvement, whether you're talking about symptom management or in this case, we're taking it to a different level of wellness, performance, you know, improving, functionality and mobility and helping us live our best selves,
What do
it's
what do you think about these CBD isolate vape pens that we're starting to see? Sports people, hitting on during press conferences and stuff. I mean, I know that generally you're a whole plant guy like I am, right?
yeah,
We want to use the whole plant, but they're so in vogue, and I know that there are people who are listening to the show because they're like, oh, cannabis and exercise, and then their sports heroes are like pushing or becoming attached to these CBD isolate pens, but for
yeah,
me,
yeah.
I think that isolate, unless you're getting your whole plant somewhere else and you're just spiking your regular daily use with some extra CBD isolate, using CBD isolate on its own doesn't sound like a great idea to me. But what are your thoughts?
I, you know, I'm not interested. I'm just not. See, I don't want to disparage any athlete stepping out and supporting CBD in any way. And I've really enjoyed meeting some great athletes in the cannabis space, and I praise them for coming out and helping normalize it because nobody helps to normalize the conversation better than these athletes that we really, as a society, tend to worship,
Yeah.
and and it's great. And CBD is a great compound, I it's it's amazing how things have shifted. But for us to be dismissing CBD in any way, right? Because CBD is great, it's part of the medicine. But yeah, the isolate, that's not what I want to be involved in developing. It's not ever going to be my first choice as a product, and it's got to be cut with other agents because CBD. And by that I mean diluted. There's something else in a vape pen than CBD because CBD doesn't stay in solution very well.
Yeah.
You talk to people in the business and they might say something like it sugars out or it crystals up or what they're meaning it comes out of solution. And that CBD does that very well. And so there will be something else added to help it dissolve, and that's something you're breathing in. And I'm cautious about that stuff. I'm not trying to dismiss any athletes, but I also know that the CBD market is booming because it's cheap. There's huge interest going into the production, and a subset of athletes. I mean, companies seek them out to give them these endorsement opportunities, and you know, again, that sounds like I'm speaking negatively about them. I'm not, but
I think it's more.
CBD
I think it's
isolate
more.
pen as a product, not interested.
Right on, I hear that, and that makes sense. And I think that the only reason that CBD isolate it got so hot in the first place is because it's an artificial market, right? We still
Yeah,
have got federal prohibition of whole plant, and for the moment, CBD isolate is only being selectively enforced by the federal government based on the claims that you're making from it, right? So even though
right,
it's
right.
Schedule 1, they're not actually going around the country and busting people. What they're busting people is for saying you cannot say that CBD will solve your whatever your issue is. So they're like, you can't say
Right,
that, but they're
right.
not busting people for having it. If we had federal whole plant legal everywhere, CBD isolate would just disappear because whole plant was so much more effective. But there's artificial prohibitions on it, and therefore, thus CBD isolate world.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I think so. And there's so much cannabis, so call them type 3 cannabis varieties, hemp varieties, whatever that are CBD producers. As you know very well, there's so much growing now in North America. And part of the boom in that CBD isolate is because it's been imported in mass in huge volumes, not as hemp flower, but as this first extract sludge that comes in from so many different places and gets then refined and distilled down into CBD. And um, there's for all these market reasons it exists. And now we're living in a space where grocery stores, health food stores are talking about selling CBD products. It's in CVS. I think Urban Outfitters is the last one I read today is going to start carrying CBD oils, and I hope that they are oils. I hope there's so much growing now and a market to support farmers that are growing and having a good farming life that that whole spectrum are fuller, less less processed oils that don't isn't taken down to the powder and sold around as a molecular commodity. Let's keep you know let's keep cannabis flower and cannabis extract oils as the health and wellness and supplement commodity, and not just boiling it down to molecules.
And I
And
think
I'm as classically trained molecular pharmacology guy as you get, but that's where I stand with it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that this is another great place for us to plug home growing, right? Like, find a chemovar that you like, grow it in your backyard over the summer, make your own tincture or smoke it yourself and know exactly what you have.
I'm never going to speak against home grow. Sometimes I've been paid by entrants, by entities that, want to have more of a market control, but whether it's a medicine or, I think we have the human right to access this plant, and nothing makes it more accessible than having a plant that you tend and learning from it. So yeah, I'm not against that.
Right on. Well, Greg, thank you so much for sharing your vast experience with us. It was really great because, you've got this unique combination where, all these years teaching anatomy and physiology, but then also your, endocannabinoid research, you provided a great entree to this nexus of ideas. So thank you so much for taking your time and joining us and being on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for putting me on.
Fantastic, brother. So if you want to connect with Greg Gerdeman, or actually just to follow along with what he's up to, the best way to do that is to go to his Instagram, and that's Ganjanesh. So that's at GANJANESH. And also, while you're at it, if you want to hear more interesting insights from Greg, go ahead and go back to Shaping Fire episode 14, all about synthetic cannabinoids. And Greg breaks down what the heck these things are and why they are not naturally occurring cannabinoids and why they are so much more dangerous for the human body compared to naturally occurring cannabinoids, which are not dangerous at all. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news and product reviews. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. For information on me and where I'll be speaking, you can check out shangolos.com. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.